Now let's tackle the topic of playing drawing hands on the flop. When you actually flop a drawing hand, this may be one of the few times that you will veer from your post-flop strategy of betting 50 to 80% of the pot after the flop, depending on the type of drawing hand you have, as well as the tendencies of your opponents. If your opponents have been at your table for a while and have seen you continuously raising before the flop and then betting virtually every flop in position, they will be even more likely to go for a check raise against you since they figure you'll bet more flops. One of the worst plays you can make in No Limit Hold'em is to shut yourself off a draw by betting yourself off the hand. For example, let's say that you raised with 6-4 hearts and the big blind called you. Something about the way he called made you suspect that he had a very strong hand. Now the flop comes King 7-3. This flop would give you a gut shot straight draw and a backdoor flush draw. Suppose in this example your opponent had ace king or even pocket kings and was looking to set a trap for you. If you bet the flop, you'll have to fold if your opponent check raises you, thus giving up the opportunity to fill your belly buster straight draw. However, if you give yourself a free card and check the flop, you could potentially win a monster pot if you hit the 5, or you could even pick up a backdoor flush draw. Now, the danger with checking this flop deals more with your overall table image. You don't want to make plays at the poker table that become too obvious to your opponents. If every time you have a drawing hand on the flop you check, but always bet with garbage or good hands, it won't take a rocket science to figure out what you're up to. There are very few absolutes when it comes to flop play. With all the added variables, stack size, position, player tendencies, flop texture, table image, you don't approach every situation the same way. You need to weigh several factors and make sure that in the end, the strategy that you're applying isn't so easy to decipher. There are several ways to mix up your play on the flop, and I'll go into more detail in another section. For now, understand that you shouldn't always check the flop with the draw, nor should you always bet the flop with top pair or even a garbage hand. We've touched on a weak drawing hand, the inside straight draw, backdoor flush draw hand. But what happens when you flop a legitimate drawing hand like a flush draw, open-ended straight draw, or even an open-ended straight flush draw with overcards? Well, as we previously mentioned, a lot of thought needs to go into whether or not you should be betting a draw or checking a draw. By betting one of these drawing hands out of position, it would be a semi-bluff that could end up backfiring if you get raised or even called. By betting the draw, you make the pot bigger, which in turn means that if your opponent raises, the raise will be bigger as well. In fact, the raise could end up being so big that it forces you off the hand. Or, if your opponent calls your bet on the flop and you miss your draw on the turn, you'll be forced to totally guess as to what you should do. Continue the bluff on the turn, check and call. You'll be forced into a difficult decision, and if you check and call, it may reek of a drawing hand and let your opponent know exactly where you're at. Your stack size should be one of the key determining factors as to whether or not you should bet the flop with the draw, whether you're in position or not. For example, if you're extremely short stacked, this would be the perfect opportunity to semi-bluff with an all-in bet. If your opponent folds, great, but even if he calls, you'll have a chance to win a good pot and double up. Or let's say you're a big stack, and your opponent has a big stack as well. In this case, it's probably safe to bet a drawing hand since you'd be able to call your opponent's raise anyway. The times you might want to check a drawing hand on the flop are those times when a raise in the flop would represent such a large portion of your stack that you're forced to lay the hand down. Now, we are talking mostly straightforward flush draws and straight draws. What if you have a monster draw? Let's say a straight and a flush draw, a pair and a flush draw, or even a flush draw with overcards. These hands are very strong hands. Usually, they end up being a statistical favorite after the flop. For example, let's give your opponent pocket aces while you have 6 of hearts, 7 of hearts on a flop of 4 of hearts, 5 of hearts, 6 of spades. Despite the fact that at the moment your opponent has you beat, you have the better hand. Your hand will end up winning the pot almost twice as often as the pocket aces. Here you can see a few more examples. So as you can see, a monster draw is a powerful hand. You can play aggressively with a draw like this because even in the worst cases, you can't be in terrible shape. By being aggressive, you give yourself several ways to win the pot. A, your opponent folds, or B, you get your money all in a coin flip type situation. Here are a few extreme scenarios where a monster draw could be in trouble. The beauty of these monster drawing hands is that even when you run into a strong made hand, you still aren't dead in the water. Even in the most extreme cases, you'll still win the pot over 25% of the time. That's not great, but it's far from dead. When deciding whether or not to bet a drawing hand in tournament poker, it should also heavily depend on what stage of the tournament you're in. This is an extension of stack size, but in general, it's much safer to bet drawing hands earlier in a tournament as opposed to later in a tournament when the blinds get high. At that stage of the tournament, you want to give yourself every opportunity to win what's already in the middle. Besides, just because you didn't pick up the pot on the flop, that doesn't mean you can't try and take the pot down on the turn with a bet if you miss your draw. There'll be more on that in the section devoted to turn play.